This isn't just another cult story. This is a story that spans over decades, involving two different apocalyptic cults and a father whose control and manipulation tore our family apart.
Family cult is a term we will use throughout this series. Like all cults, family cults operate under cult-like dynamics, revolving around a central figure, which in our case was our father.
This person assumes a position of authority and control within the family, in which a disproportionate amount of power and influence is exerted over its members.
Manipulation, coercion, and psychological tactics are used to maintain strict control.
In our family, our father distorted religious and spiritual beliefs to serve his own agenda. We were discouraged from critical thinking, and dissent was absolutely forbidden.
While there was an outward facade of personal autonomy, any true decision-making was predicated upon keeping within the narrow boundaries of his approval.
Our experiences stemmed from a mixture of learned cult tactics and behaviors, and the personality types of the men who ran these groups. Narcissism is marked foremost by a grandiose sense of self, a distortion of reality, and an innate need for control.
These stories cannot be told without acknowledging the impact narcissistic character traits had on these men, and in turn, the wake of debris that was left behind them as a result.
The Worldwide Church of God, a doomsday cult led by Herbert W. Armstrong, first discovered by our father as he and our mother were just starting their family, groomed our father to become the authoritarian leader of our own family cult system. We were a cult within a cult.
In this series, we will discuss these origins as well as how it came to be that our father became the leader of his own destructive cult, the Crusade Church.
We will talk with family members, past members of Worldwide, and exited members of the Crusade Church.
We are the oldest and youngest of 5 siblings, each with unique perspectives and experiences of the trauma we all endured.
The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong.
And there has been many, many false churches. Jesus said, I will build my church. He didn't say, I will build my churches. But there is a true church that is undeceived.
Well, the Lord gave me a revelation, a very important revelation.
Jesus Christ himself reveals it. It's not my revealing. It's not the revealing of Herbert W. Armstrong. It's the revealing of Jesus Christ. But this is the way he reveals it.
But I do see the demons when they're in someone, and they see me. I could talk about demons all day long right here. I can name demons by name. The devil has everybody out there. He already has them. He's not worried about them. He's concerned about you.
My name is Matty Lassiter. I was in 2 doomsday cults that spanned 32 years. The first 7 years were spent in the Worldwide Church of God and its offshoots, and the last 20 years of which were spent in a cult called Crusade Church, founded and led by my father. I've been out of the cult for 3 years, but there are so many people and groups that share some of the same characteristics that make these cults next door so dangerous.
My name is Ashley Teeter, and I'm Maddie's older sister. Our father brought my mother and I into the Worldwide Church of God when I was just 3 or 4 years old. And then when I was 17, the Worldwide Church of God split, and my family left the church and went with one of the 2 main splinter groups. After about 2 to 2.5 years, our father started his own group. The Worldwide Church of God was incredibly controlling, with a focus on the end time and a heavy emphasis on the Old Testament, but our father's teachings were even more controlling and disturbing. In a series of events, which we'll get into later in this podcast, I confronted our father about what he was doing, as it was very unsettling to me. When he realized I was not in lockstep with him, he forced me out of the family. The result was severed communication with my mother and 4 siblings. This estrangement lasted for 25 years until the summer of 2020, when I was finally able to reconnect with my family and with Maddie, and here we are today.
So the Worldwide Church of God, which was the first cult that I was in, was a Christian denomination founded in 1934 by a man named Herbert W. Armstrong. He grew up in a Quaker family, And then when he was a young man, he became interested in religion, began attending a lot of different churches, but he was generally just kind of dissatisfied with what he saw as a lack of understanding of the Bible. In the early 1930s, Armstrong became involved with the Church of God Seventh Day, which was a small Sabbath-keeping denomination. In 1933, Armstrong began publishing a magazine called The Plain Truth, which quickly gained following among readers who were dissatisfied with mainstream Christianity as they saw it. The following year, Armstrong and a group of like-minded individuals split off from the Church of God Seventh Day to form the Radio Church of God, which eventually would be renamed Worldwide Church of God.
So our father ended up joining this cult. He was 18 years old, 19 years old, and was exposed to the Radio Church of God through his uncle, who owned a gas station that our dad worked at. And so on his downtime, he was able to listen to this radio program. And I just guess he was looking for some kind of meaning in his life. He did not have the best childhood and beginnings. And so I always felt like he was probably looking for something. And he found it in the Worldwide Church of God because they promised you the world, basically. If you did all the things that they told you to do, you were going to have treasures stored in heaven. You were going to be among, a very few amount of people on the earth that know God and that are going to be able to be God's sons and daughters someday. And I think that really appealed to him, that he was someone special. And so when I was 3 or 4, around that time, he introduced this church to our mom, and she was resistant at first. But if you know our dad, he does not take no for an answer and is a very commanding type of person. And so eventually he got our mother on board to attend church services, and this was a Sabbath keeping church. And so I was 3 or 4. Our next sibling was born when I was 4, so we started going to church around that time, the 4 of us, every Saturday. And one thing to note is these church services were multi-hour church services. And children were expected to lay on a blanket and be completely still and silent. It did not matter if this was a 1-year-old child. That was the expectation. And you ran the risk of having an elder come and, counsel you. I put that in air quotes, if your child was quote unquote out of line. And so from a really early age, all of us, being born into this, were experiencing a level of control and suppression of emotions, of energy. It was really difficult.
I remember, obviously I wasn't around at that time when Dad joined Worldwide, but I remember stories he's told. And I think just for context, people wondering why do people join cults?
Yeah.
I know at that time, my dad was an aspiring musician.
Yeah.
He had a new child in the family. He was newlywed, had been married at that time, just a couple years or 3 or something like that. And so his, life was kind of turned upside down at that point because the things that he thought he was going to be, those things were happening. And I think also for context, and you mentioned it, like being special and important was important to him.
Yes.
So having that message is what drew him. So I think, and we'll demonstrate some other things throughout this series and talk to some other people, but there are lots of different things, cult tactics, and how they draw people that make sense. My wife and I have talked about this where, she's explained to new friends that we have when they will ask things like, why did you join a cult? It's like, well, no one joins a cult, quote unquote. Like, you join a group that in some way you feel like gives you meaning, whether it's like in our dad's case, he wanted to feel special, like there was something different or a special knowledge, or maybe it's for people who want community. I know it was that way for my wife, Elizabeth. Like, she wanted community. She didn't have that. And then it's different for other people who are raised in it. Like, you have so much tied to it. I know it was that way for me. I think if I had to boil it down, like, my entire life was centered around it. You don't have a life outside of it.
That's your direction.
Yeah. So what are you going to do if you leave? Like, you potentially lose your family. Your friend group is that. You weren't, really allowed to have close friends that weren't in that group because they could be a bad influence, obviously.
That's correct. It was that way in Worldwide as well. You could not have, you could, I say you couldn't have friends. It was not encouraged. And any friends that I had that were not in the church, most of the time they could come to our house. I could not go to their house.
Remember that too.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, like, we didn't do a lot of going to other people's houses.
No.
We could have sleepovers at our house because they could be, the situation could be controlled.
Exactly. And maybe our family example, could be, it could influence someone that we have over.
Yeah, and we, our family, not to sidetrack, but our family kind of dabbled in the homeschool stuff, and I was homeschooled for some time, and you were, and,
No, I was only homeschooled 1 year.
Okay. They couldn't take more than a year.
Yeah, I think after I left is when he was really like, oh man, we've got to make sure that we just have super tight reins on everyone. And how do we do that? One way.
Yeah,
Don't let them go to school.
I think, like, I remember even when I was like in middle school, kind of being encouraged to influence my friend groups at school. Like, that was kind of, you weren't just going to school. You couldn't be a kid and just go to school, God forbid.
Oh, no.
You had to go on mission. But then I think once I hit a certain age and they realized, like, oh, he's not on mission quite anymore, that's when they pulled me. I know that was a direct, like, correlation. I don't even know if we've talked about that.
No, we haven't.
But it was a direct result of me not following the path. So
I do think we should mention about Worldwide that in Worldwide, we did not keep any of the holidays. Outside of Thanksgiving, we did not participate in Halloween, Christmas, Easter. Those were considered pagan holidays because of their, pre-Christian origins. And so not participating in those things had its own way of setting us apart from our friends and everyone else that we might come in contact with that, did not believe like we did. So I remember you're talking about not following the path. I remember having Christmas caroling going on in the school during the month of December, and Mom and Dad told me, you can't sing Christmas carols. You have to excuse yourself from this.
Did you go to the library?
I either went to the library or I stayed, I know I went in the office sometimes. And then there were occasions where I stayed in the classroom and everyone would pour out into the hallways and sing. And of course, wherever I was, I could hear it. And I always just remember feeling so small and just like, oh no, today is a day that they're going to sing carols. And number one, I don't want to be the weird kid that can't do this. And what do you tell someone in second grade? I don't sing these songs because they're pagan. It was such an awkward position to be put in. But yeah, those were some of the worst memories about being in the public school system. So I could see, in a way, maybe some of that was a relief for you. I don't know, not to have to be the weird one.
See, by that point, though, I think my first year, it was the last 3 years of school that I homeschooled. So all the way
Oh,
through
okay.
ninth. Yeah.
Okay.
But like I
Right when
remember.
you could have started liking girls, or
Oh, that's what happened.
Okay.
I was going to say, it's because I
Okay.
started liking girls too much and
We can't have
get a hold of
that.
that. But yeah, I remember being the weird kid and being in the library with the one other Jehovah's Witness kid in the
no.
school who also isn't
That's
singing
right.
Christmas
Yeah.
carols. But yeah, when you're a little kid, you're trying to figure out, how do you tell somebody why you're not? These other kids don't understand. They just think you're weird. So it already puts that pressure on you.
Yeah.
And then I remember at some point, it's probably a defense mechanism. Like, instead of being the weird kid, you're the kid who knows the truth.
Oh,
and
I
is set
took that
apart.
mantle.
Yeah, for sure. You have to, I
yeah.
think, or you just collapse inside
Yeah.
yourself. So then you begin to take pride in, you're different because you know this and you do these things differently. You keep these holy days and you don't keep these holidays because you know better, because you were taught better and you're in the special group. And I know, having been out now, it's so clear looking back. Like, I had an awful lot of pride, which was ironic because we would hear that, preached about a lot, about how we shouldn't. But we certainly had a lot of pride in our black and white binary
Absolutely.
in and out group, which is just such a weird thing to think about now, because it really was it was said that we shouldn't, but that's exactly what we did, was take
Well, it
pride in what we knew.
engendered pride. That is literally the result of telling someone, you are so special. You are more special than all the people you see around you. I remember Dad saying, all these people, they don't know God. And they said that in Worldwide as well. In Worldwide, they called out specific, well, not just religions, which they did that too, but specific Christian denominations, saying, specifically, I remember hearing this, Pat Robertson does not know God, things like that. And it's like, it's not his fault though. He just he hasn't been called by God. And so you just start to think, wow, God wants me. God wants me and his family. And
Makes
how
you
can
feel
you not
special.
walk around thinking like you're a little bit better than everybody else?
And, Herbert W. Armstrong, when, he started it, and you may have heard a clip in the intro where he even says, like, God said, I will build my church, not churches, like one.
That's right.
So, Herbert and everybody else stepped in line. It was one true church, not a few. Like, if you weren't in Worldwide,
there was one path. That's it.
Yeah, that was it. You weren't doing it right if you weren't doing it the Worldwide way. And if you're doing it the Worldwide way, why wouldn't you be in Worldwide? You're not going to be in another
Right.
group, which that carried over into Crusade Church, which was the offshoot that our dad started later. And we'll get into some more of that. But, some of the other ways that Worldwide was different, you mentioned, like, we didn't keep any of the holidays, but we kept all the weird holy days.
The weird holy days,
Yeah,
yes.
that people couldn't pronounce, like Feast of Tabernacles. They didn't know what you were talking about.
Yes. Days of Unleavened Bread, which I have a little story about that too, which, if listeners don't know, that is a 7-day period where you do not eat anything with leavening in it, which is yeast products and anything that would cause bread to rise. And there was debate over whether beer was okay because there's yeast in beer. And we would spend, well, I say we, the women in the church would spend an inordinate amount of time cleaning their homes, because you were supposed to get rid of all of the leavening out of your house. That did not mean take the bread and toss it in the garbage. That meant, if you had a table with, tables that have leaves in them and there's like the little crack, you take a butter knife and you scrape in there and you make sure there are no crumbs. It was insane. We cleaned out drawers in the top of the closets. It's hard to imagine. And I just remember it being such a stressful time. So you get all the leavening out of your house, and that is supposed to symbolize sin. You're working on getting sin out of your life, and the idea that sin could be stuck in the leaf crack of this table meant that, it's supposed to signify that, sin can be found anywhere, and you can think you're doing really great, but actually you're not, because you're always sinning in some way you don't even realize. So then for 7 days, you don't eat leavening. And I remember back to second grade in Miss Murray's class, someone brought donuts during Days of Unleavened Bread. And donuts are a weakness for me, especially a glazed donut. There's almost nothing as a child that I loved better than a glazed donut. And I just remember thinking, oh no, this is a test. Like, God is testing me, and I don't know what to do because I want a donut so bad. And I debated it, and I thought, no, I'm not going to eat the donut. Well, I ended up eating the donut, and I carried.
And here you are now.
Look where I am now. I carried that guilt my entire childhood and into my adult life, because I knew what God expected of me in my mind, and I willingly chose something else that wasn't His will. And I asked for forgiveness so many times, which reminds me of Book of Mormon, where he ate the donut. Yeah. So back to, our weird holy days. Yeah. And we're taking off school on these holy days so that we can go and have an all-day church service.
And then Feast of Tabernacles, which if you are curious about any of these, it's not going to give you a whole lot of insight, but you can find the description of these holy days and how they're meant to be kept in the Old Testament. I think like in the books of Leviticus or wherever. I should know that.
Yeah, you should know
I've purged it, I guess.
Verses.
Yeah, I should. But if you want to know, you can look those up. But they're not even remotely well known. There are a few that people will be aware of, not the way we probably kept them, but like they've heard of Passover, they've heard of Pentecost, but
not the way we kept Passover.
No, certainly not, and like Pentecost too, not really. And then but we had all of these holy days that set us apart, and then like I said, the Feast of Tabernacles was it was 7 days, but with the 8th day being the last great day, a separate feast that bookends it, where we're like pulled out of school. We were traveling to Texas or to South Carolina or somewhere.
We were like 10 days.
Yeah, we're out of school and like off somewhere. So
it was in the fall, so it was always at the beginning of the school year, relatively speaking.
So we're tough. The weird kids on that part too, which kind of doesn't help when you're a little kid trying to explain to people where you're going and what you're doing. I mean, it kind of goes back to at some point you have to embrace it because you're in it. But yeah, that's one of the things that kind of set Worldwide apart. No holidays except for, I think,
Thanksgiving.
4th of July.
Oh yeah, 4th of July.
But anything that is a Christian kind of holiday, or certainly not Halloween, but Christmas was enemy number one. Like Easter is out, those kind of holidays. And then, of course, like we mentioned earlier, like we were a Saturday Sabbath keeping church. And this was not just a, go to church at 11 a.m. for an hour and a half and have a service. Like, and this carried through until I left Crusade Church. Like, you're in it. It's all day. And then, of course, with Crusade, it started the night before on Friday night. So this is like you have some breaks in there. You get to go sleep most times, but you've got like a 24-hour period where like it's filled up. So those are the things that Worldwide and Crusade Church kind of hung their hats on that made them different just right off the bat when you look at them from just like, mainstream Christianity.
Right. And don't forget, we did not eat lard.
Oh, yeah. We didn't even get into any. Yeah, that's another thing that made us weird. We kept as far as we could tell, the biblical food laws. So
Yeah,
if
clean and
you,
unclean
yeah,
meats.
if you know any practicing Jews, that's what we were at least aspiring to
Yes.
do. So
And I remember when you were just a little toddler, the Ritz crackers were made with lard. And Mom found an off brand called Hi Ho crackers that had vegetable shortening. And you loved those as a kid.
staying holy. So maybe since you were there for this, we've
Yeah.
kind of covered what made Worldwide different and or weird.
So many. I mean, that's probably a whole other
Oh, yeah.
podcast too to even talk about, because Worldwide was very racist as well. They wouldn't say that, but they were totally racist.
Yeah. And lots and lots of abuses on all kinds of levels in
Oh,
that church.
so much. And there was a lot of corruption and the tithing situation. I mean, the tithing thing, I just destroyed people. You were to give 10% of your income to the church. And that was gross income. That was not, the net. That was off the top. You were also required to save an additional 10% to spend at the Feast of Tabernacles. And then okay, this is a little bit complicated, but I believe it's in a 7-year period. There are 2 times where you would have a third tithe.
Okay.
It's every third year in a 7-year period, I believe.
See, I think by the Crusade Church era, we were not
You were not
doing
doing
that.
that.
And we had stopped doing the second tithe for the holy days, but then it was reintroduced. I don't know, it's probably been less than 10 years, but there was a gap there
Oh,
where
I
we were
didn't know
not
that.
doing that.
Okay.
But then on these holy days, like for the Feast of Tabernacles, for example, you've got the first day, there's an offering.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last great day, the 8th day, there's an offering. And then the same thing, the Feast of Unleavened Bread
Oh,
and
offerings.
Pentecost.
Yeah.
And, all these other holy days that we kept, like there are offerings as they were commanded. Of course, in the Old Testament, it talks about, not money, but giving, vegetables and fruits and your lamb and things like that. But it, of course, became modernized and it was money. So you were giving at minimum your 10% tithe and then significant offerings multiple times a year. And they were mandatory. This was not if you want to. Like this was expected and mandatory. And that went from Worldwide and all the way through to when we left Crusade.
Oh, I remember as a child in Worldwide, at least on one occasion, hearing a sermon. I don't remember who it was, but he was basically reprimanding the congregation for not being more generous with their offerings. And then keep in mind, Herbert Armstrong had a private jet and, a mansion and the most expensive watches and very expensive 5-star meals. And he did not try to hide that. In fact, he said that God wanted him to experience what it would be like in the kingdom. And when he would go meet with a dignitary or someone regarding Worldwide Church of God, he needed to present that the finest. The demographic was poor.
Yeah.
These people, I remember our parents struggling to make rent or utility bills, but they're still tithing because you had to do that. That was the number one priority, even if you lost power, lost electricity, or your water got shut off. You had to tithe.
And Worldwide was not a small church. I don't meet people now that know Worldwide just because it's been long enough now. But they were not a small denomination. had hundreds of thousands of members. And think about that, all those members and the tithes and the offerings coming in. So it was not a poor organization. They had a headquarters, they had magazines, they had television programming. Like, if you have heard of them, that's probably
Yeah.
how you're aware of them.
It's
Is the money they
120,
spent.
sorry, it was 120,000 members at its peak all over the world.
So Worldwide was going strong until Herbert W. Armstrong, who was the founder, the Iron Fist leader of that church, he passed in 1986. And that, from that point, that's when things kind of began to change and led to where I ended up and where we are today. So obviously I was not alive at that point when he died. Maybe go into a little bit of
Yeah.
kind of what happened after he passed.
Yeah, I mean, I was a kid, but from what I remember, when Herbert Armstrong died in 86, Joseph W. Tkach, I don't know why these cult leaders like to have their middle initial, but they really do. So he took over, and he was, pre-appointed. He knew upon Herbert's death that he was going to be the one to take over the church. And, it was him and the Council of Elders. I don't know how many people that consisted of, but they, behind closed doors, decided to take Worldwide mainstream. And they knew that this was a precarious thing that they were trying to do. And so they wanted to just kind of, inch their way towards mainstream. And there are places online where you can read about that and the whole process and kind of what their end goal was. But I don't remember specifically what it was, but there was one Sabbath where there were some announcements made that were directly from headquarters, and it had everyone in a tailspin after that. And I remember just the tone in the building and the energy. It was different after church was over. People were finding each other and, talking about, what does this mean? I know our dad approached the minister at the time wanting to know, what does this mean? This sounds really mainstream, and I wish I could remember what that was, but it was just a progression of things. And it seemed like every Sabbath, at least from my child perspective, it seemed like every Sabbath something new would be announced from the pulpit, and everyone would be upset afterwards. And then there came a point, and I remember Dad being incredibly depressed. I don't know that I had ever seen him that way, but it was devastating to him. And of course, at this point, by the time they really started to take things mainstream, it was the early 90s. So Dad had invested a lot, almost 20 years into this. He was really somber and serious every day. I remember that. And then he heard that there was someone who was considering breaking off from the Worldwide Church of God, who was going to uphold Herbert Armstrong's belief system. And this person had basically come through the ranks with Herbert Armstrong and had been with him personally at headquarters for many years, and that was Roderick Meredith. And it did end up that Rod Meredith left and started his own group, and then lots and lots of groups were formed. There was one other main group called the United Church of God, but I really think it was a matter of, who do you like? Like, what leader do you like? And see, I don't even remember who the leader was of United, because it was someone who was less like Herbert Armstrong. But Rod Meredith was similar to Herbert Armstrong in his ability to kind of capture attention and command authority. And so a lot of people wanted to follow him, and of course our dad was looking for a leader like that, and he felt like God provided this way for us to continue. And so that was in 1992, and we went with, it was called the Global Church of God at the time. It's since changed its name to Living Church of God, but that is where we went. And I think they only had about 2,000 people or something like that. That number comes to mind when they first started. And I don't know, would you remember any of that? You're still probably too young.
I even remember, like you mentioned earlier, like I remember sleeping in between the rows of chairs. We didn't have pews at Worldwide as I remember it.
No.
But I remember sleeping on a blanket, and expectation was to play quietly. We learned that early. And then I remember also probably some global Feast of Tabernacles, during that span of time. But, I was so young, it's kind of fuzzy.
Yeah.
But I still remember bits and pieces of that, and a lot of what I picked up that Worldwide and Global taught was, in the early years of Crusade, which at the time it was formed was not called Crusade. It was, I don't even remember now, it was some Church of God, which, as you mentioned earlier, I don't know if we got it on the podcast, that was kind of the moniker of any true church. It had to
Oh,
be
yeah.
called Church of God. So we had that. But yeah, I remember
God
little
would know.
bits. Yeah, so he can tell. But I remember little bits of Worldwide and Global, but my main experience was obviously Crusade
Right.
with
Yeah. At that time when it was, I'm just going to say Living Church of God, since it wasn't global for very long. When the Living Church of God, when Rod Meredith's group broke off, the problem was all of these worldwide Church of God congregations were still existent. So you had some of the people leaving, most of the people staying at the beginning, and so there was a real problem with money, for one thing. How do you pay for rental spaces for these new congregations now? And also there was not a ministry to minister to these different congregations. So Rod Meredith and a few others were producing videos that they were sending out to groups to play on Saturday. And that was the church service, essentially. And along with that, they asked different members in different cities if they personally had any space to hold some of these services in. Because, I think when ours started in Russellville, Arkansas, there may have been 10 people that were part of the group that split off, maybe even less that first Sabbath. So it didn't even make financial sense, if there were, the finances there to support it, to rent anything. And so our dad had a building that he worked out of, an extra space in that building, and he offered that up as a place to host Sabbath services. So our dad became a host of Living Church of God service. And so the sermon video would be mailed to dad, and then he would be responsible for pushing play on Saturdays. And that bit of power, literally, that is how we ended up sitting here today.
Yeah.
It is. I don't know if we would be here in this way if he had not been given that small responsibility back then.
And I think that probably gave him a sense of ownership, so to speak, where he felt like he was invested somehow
Yes.
more than just a regular member.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of how that snowballed. We'll get into it, I'm sure, lots more. But our dad did not have a background in preaching.
Mm-mm.
Was not a minister up to that point. I think probably
Not
the most he had done was to lead hymns, which is something that Worldwide did, but that's not a leadership position.
He wasn't ordained
no,
as a
no.
deacon or an elder.
No.
Absolutely nothing.
So no leadership of any
Right.
kind. And even this as host and button pusher was not a leadership, but because living at that time was in such like a state of flux, like honestly, if you just want to call it what it is, there was a vacuum at that point of power. And I
Yeah.
think at that point in our dad's life, he did not want to leave that up to chance. And he
No.
knew how
Yeah.
he wanted it to be and the right way that the church should be run. So
Yeah, and I think he had a sense of entitlement, which, we'll talk about this later, but as most cult leaders do, he exhibited a lot of narcissistic characteristics. And one of those characteristics is a sense of entitlement. And I think when he left the church, he was one of the first to say, hey, I don't, something is wrong here. This is apostasy. This is going against what God's will is for his church. And I have to be the one to take a stand and have the courage to do this. And because he was one of the first ones, other people who started thinking, hey, I may want to leave too, they went to him, which is natural. But I think he really relished that position. He really enjoyed being the one that people were asking questions of and getting guidance from. And then to top it off, he's the host and he's the one receiving the tape from headquarters. And I just think he kind of, like you said, had ownership of the congregation as if it were his own, even though he really was just a member of it. And I remember when he had been doing this alone for maybe a year, and the congregation was growing because Worldwide was still leaking out people, And
he had a farm system for living or global at that time because as more things were introduced in Worldwide that people considered apostate, it was kind of there would be breaking points for people where they're like, okay, I can
Absolutely.
stomach this, I can stomach that, can't stomach this. So it was just like a matter of time where these people were filtering out of Worldwide and into these splinter groups, which I guess at that time global/living was the main one that people would go to.
That's a good point too, because it wasn't, everyone had their own breaking point, I guess. After enough people and enough ministers came, elders came and joined Living Church of God, and our congregation was, I don't know, what did we have, 50 people? But at the time, but it was sizely enough that they decided it was time to send us an actual minister who would, it wasn't just the Russellville congregation. He had several congregations because most of the ministers did. They definitely didn't have the resources to have one in each congregation.
And cue the dramatic music.
For sure. And so, I mean, do we say his name? I mean, I heard it my whole, for years. Dr. Jeffrey Fall walks in, and nice enough. I mean, looking back on it, I'm like, I don't know what your perception is of this, but I look back at it like this man did nothing but just walk in to give sermons and talk to people and counsel people, albeit we're still talking about we're in a cult and it's very controlling and all of that. But wow, Dad took personal offense about literally everything about him. And even as, at the age I was at, which I guess was by this time I'm 20, 21 or something, I could recognize that this was in part due to jealousy. this was some competition going on in Dad's mind. And I remember thinking, well, he's gonna have to let go a little bit. He's been the person to get the tape and push play, and then that's just not where we're at anymore.
And for context too, because I would hate for anyone to think that all of this was out of the blue. Now, like you said, Dad he never up to that point had held any like position in the church. However, and if you want to look into this, I suggest that you do. But looking back, what I would consider our family was a family cult. And I don't mean that like as a derogatory term. I mean it as an actual
100%.
term by definition. So this was not new to him. So like the tactics that he would later transfer over, he had already been using and had learned while he was in Worldwide too. So I think it was just one of those perfect storms with him where he kind of had this disposition to begin with. The grandiosity was a major thing for him, importance, being different, separate, holy, whatever you want to call it.
And he prided himself on having very tight control of us.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether, be in the church environment, we were a reflection on him. His children did not make noise during church.
Yeah, we had to be an exemplary family.
Absolutely. And we were taken out and spanked during services. I don't know if you remember that, but I definitely remember that. And that's for like the smallest little infraction. You just couldn't make noise. But the whole thing was a reflection on him.
Yeah, so while he didn't hold any of those positions of power up to that point within the ministry of the church, he was not a stranger to the tactics necessary to run one effectively.
Yeah.
So that just want to kind of throw that in there so that people don't think that this just kind of happened. Like, no, this is
he'd been practicing.
Yes, this is kind of a process. And then when Dr. Fall showed up, that was kind of the trigger. It really was like, I hate to, use the, cliche term, but it really kind of was a perfect storm. All these things kind of happened at the right or wrong time.
Absolutely.
For this to kind of veer off the way that it did. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But
I remember Dad becoming more and more disgruntled, having more and more negative things to say about Dr. Fall. And Dad felt controlled, which is a very ironic thing to acknowledge. But why he felt like we were being controlled, I think one reason was Dr. Fall, I believe, wanted us to change our services time. It had to do with his schedule because he was supposed to be in Mountain Home and then I think Russellville, and he had to drive. And so I think this was a matter of just trying to logistically make this work to cover the miles. And Dad thought, I shouldn't even say he thought. Dad argued that this was going to really be an inconvenience for some of the older people and the widows in the church. And even at the time, even though I still was totally in this, I still thought, okay, that's a little bit reaching, and he just really built up this case against Dr. Fall in his mind that Dr. Fall was trying to control us and that this is not what God wanted. And so Dad decided in order to protect the flock, Dad was going to have to break away from this. And he encouraged us all to write letters to our regional pastor, who at the time I think lived in Texas or Louisiana, I'm not sure which, and let him know why we could no longer be associated with the Living Church of God. I wrote one of those letters. I bought into the narrative, even if I knew, okay, some of this is ego. There's some ego involved here. I can see it. But at the same time, it goes back to the family cult. Dad was somewhat infallible. Whatever we might have seen that would appear as weakness, overall, God was working with him, right? I mean,
Yeah, and even like, my brother Michael and I had talked about the moments when we stopped associating dad with God.
yeah,
So if that gives the listener some context, and I'm sure that's familiar to some people who are listening, but there really wasn't much separation there. Even if we thought for some reason he was wrong, we thought we were probably wrong about him being wrong, is how I felt.
exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, they were tied together to where it wasn't just, oh, that's dad. Like,
No,
no,
not at all.
that was not the way it was. So that permeated the church as it went from there also.
So we left, and of course we kept attending in Dad's building, and some of the people stayed because I think there was a camaraderie because some of the people made this in their lives. This was a huge leap, leaving Worldwide, and they made that together along with Dad, or shortly thereafter, or he counseled them or helped them through these emotional consequences of losing their community. And so some of those people came and others stayed with Global, which was a whole other thing, that isolated us even more than we already were, because now I don't think I had a single friend anywhere near my age. I'm sure you didn't at that time in the church. It was all elderly people, and for the most part, and so anyway, we were even more isolated than we were before.
So at the point that dad and Dr. Fall were clearly at odds, there was a split there. So it was a split within the split. So some people went with dad, some people went with Dr. Fall, but that's kind of the genesis of what was Church of God Fellowship, and then later was morphed into Crusade Church of God, and then just Crusade Church. But that's kind of like how it really started, where it went from, dad led hymns sometimes at Worldwide to hosting and pressing the button on the VHS to now it's his church. So that's kind of the beginnings of that. So I know you were there
Right.
for that and remember, at least I
Yeah.
was there, but I was just a little feller.
Yeah.
So maybe talk
Tiny.
about that space of time from when we really broke off from the other offshoots and all of that.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, it just came back to memory that Dad did not break off and say, I'm the new leader of this church. This was a progression into him actually becoming a cult leader. I remember he sought out video sermons from others in other splinter groups of people who he felt like were preaching, quote unquote, the truth. And that is how it started out. And obviously, it was just little by little, and I don't know at what point he started giving the sermons. In fact, that may have been after I left that he really started that. At the time that he decided to break off, our sister Sarah and I had already applied to the Living Church of God summer camp months previous to this. And I remember it being a question of whether we should continue, like, should we attend that camp or not. Sarah was going to be a camper and I was going to be a counselor. And, we both really wanted to go. That was one of the only times that we would get to really be with other kids, and those would be encouraged relationships. And we had already built relationships with some of these kids who lived all over the country, and we were really looking forward to going. And for whatever reason, honestly, unknown to me, Dad said yes. We went, and but my sister and I both met this guy who taught dance and volleyball. Well, he stayed in contact with us after the summer camp, and it turns out he was interested in me. He was looking for a wife, as one does in the Worldwide Church of God and Living Church of God. And because it was not forbidden, but it was really considered a really bad thing if you married someone outside of the church. Like, you would be unequally yoked at that point, and there would be a lot of counseling involved, and there would be a big play to get your significant other on board with the church. And so in our family, that was anathema. You do not even consider going on a date with someone. And not that we were even allowed to go on dates.
And it's not uncommon for people who are Christians raised in a Christian home to, those parents to not want their child to marry someone who's not. When we say not in the church, we're not just talking about not like in
the Christian faith.
Yeah, we're talking about in this particular.
Right. And which at the time we may have had 15 or 20 people. So
it's a small pool.
A small pool. Options were not good. And so I remember that his name was Kurt. He asked if he could come visit our family, and Mom and Dad said yes. And he came for the weekend. He made his interest in me known. And by the time Mom and Dad realized that he was actually interested in dating me and for the purpose of marriage, because that was the only reason that you did date in the church, they became alarmed because we were already out of the Living Church of God. He was very much in the Living Church of God, and his dad was in the ministry in the Living Church of God. And he was also not a yes man. He was definitely not aggressive with his thoughts, but he had no problem disagreeing with Dad. And Dad was not used to that. If you know him, you know that one thing you don't do is disagree with him. You do not vocalize that. There's a price. And I just remember Kurt disagreeing with him in a really neutral way. Just like, well, that's not how I see it, kind of thing. Just like, we can agree to disagree on this one, so to speak. And I saw this flash across Dad's face, and I remember knowing then, oh, this is not going to be good. With Kurt, I was 20 years old. I'd never dated a boy in my life. Of course, being raised in the church as a girl, my whole purpose in life was to eventually marry someone who was in the church and have children, and I was to be my husband's helpmeet. I did not have aspirations beyond that because that was really not something that was ever presented to us. Dating was completely new to me, and quite frankly, I was not ready for that at all. I was not ready to be dating anyone. I didn't even understand. I just felt really lost. We were so sheltered. And Kurt was 7 years older than me, and so he was very much about like, it's time for me to find my wife, you know? After that first visit, he asked maybe a month later if he could come back. And I said yes. And this time he took me on like an actual real date. And we went to dinner, and he told me he really liked me. And we were talking on the phone during the week some. And this didn't feel serious for me, but I think I didn't understand the gravity of this for him. As we were going along, Dad realized that, hey, this boy is interested in my daughter. I guess Kurt and I we met in August. This was Thanksgiving. Somehow he ended up coming to Thanksgiving with us, which does seem really early now that I think about it. I'm not sure how that came about. But he came to Thanksgiving, and the night before Thanksgiving, he took me out, and he specifically asked Dad, even though at this point I had just turned 21, he said, does she have a curfew? Dad said, and you can attest to this so well. No, she's an adult. That's her choice. She doesn't have a curfew. I'm not going to be the person that tells her what to do. That's a total cover, by the way. And so we came home at 1 a.m. And that was because we drove an hour and 20 minutes to Little Rock for our date. So we came home a little later, and I think I had even called ahead and told Dad, he stayed up really late, and I knew he would be up anyway. And we walked in, and Kurt left, and Dad, I remember him looking at me, and he just said, have a seat. And I see you wince because you know exactly what that means. You're just about to get just ripped to shreds.
Yeah, all of us kids have heard that many, many times.
Yeah. And he just starts in about how it's disrespectful of me to be out until 1 a.m. This is after just hours previous saying, no, she doesn't have a curfew. I'm not telling her what time to come home. I remember feeling really blindsided, just dumbfounded that this conversation was going down like it was. And he was very upset. And he started talking about how I didn't actually have any business dating Kurt because Kurt was not baptized. Now, I was baptized, and I got baptized when I was 20 years old, which was very early, actually, in the church. They didn't typically baptize people that young. I would say mid-20s or so would be when you start seeing baptisms. But, I was all in, and I got counseling, and the regional pastor determined that I was ready to make this sacrifice, which I have to say, they scare you to death. I don't know how it was with Dad after I left, but I was supposed to read the scriptures regarding counting the cost, because if I turned my back on God, and what that meant was on the faith, on that particular church, although they didn't say it that way, that's what we all knew it meant. If I turned my back on God, there would be no sacrifice left for me. All that would be condemnation. I would be thrown into a lake of fire. And so it was a very serious proposition getting baptized. That took a lot of counseling before they would consider doing that. And they said, we think you're ready. And I did get baptized. And so fast forward, I'm dating this guy who is 27, almost 28, and he was not baptized. And so in Dad's mind, he was just not converted. He was not serious. And that was really the only evidence that they could point to.
It was enough.
It was enough. Yep. And I remember Dad saying, "What fellowship has Christ with Baal?" I think that's in like 1st or 2nd Corinthians. And he compared my relationship with Kurt to that scripture. And I was not one to ever disagree with Dad verbally, like out loud to him. I might think some things in my head like, but I'm never gonna like say that. That was just considered a disrespect. And so at this point, I just felt like I had to say something because that just seemed so outrageous to me. And, we had learned about the god Baal and the bloody sacrifices to Baal and the child sacrifices. And it was so, such a scary and really vivid memory that I had of those descriptions of Baal. And so I just remember when he read that scripture being like, what are you talking about? So this guy has he's had baptism counseling, but he hasn't been baptized yet. But you're comparing him to this, And so I very gingerly said, well, I just don't think that is the way that I would interpret that scripture. There's no way to tell him. There's literally no way, right? You can't tell him that you disagree. You can't tell him that his interpretation of anything is wrong or that you don't agree with it. He just completely flew off the handle. He also brought up the scripture, as we talked about earlier, being unequally yoked. And I said that I did not feel like that was what this was. And he got up and stood over me as I sat in the chair with his hand back to hit me. Like it made him that angry that I was disagreeing. And I didn't raise my voice. I'm just like, I don't think that's what that means, And so that conversation was a 4.5 to, okay, that ended at 5:30. So that was like 1 to 5:30. That's how long that conversation was. And I was a total mess. I was crying. I was on the floor in the bathroom. I just went to the bathroom and just slumped down onto the floor. And my whole body was just shaking. I was just silent sobbing because I just couldn't even breathe. And Mom had heard all of it. And she came in there and gave me like a half a Valium that she had for vertigo and had me take it. I didn't even know I was taking. I'm just like, she's handing me this and then water. And then she brought in these tea bags for me to put on my eyes so they wouldn't be so swollen because we had Thanksgiving the next day. Yeah. So the next day at Thanksgiving, we pretended, put on our happy faces at Granddad and Grandma's. And then that night, Kurt and I had another date because he was there for the weekend. This was already set up. And Dad didn't say that I couldn't. And keep in mind, I'm 21 years old, needing permission to go out to dinner with someone. And we went out, and this time I asked him for a curfew. We came back at midnight, and I tried to make it upstairs, and he told me to come back. And it was another very long talk. I think this one was 4 hours. It was a little bit shorter than the night before. I remember that. And he really, really, really wanted us to agree on these scriptures. And when I didn't agree with him, and I I mean, I'm just trying to stress this. I respectfully disagreed with him. He just said, well, it's just time for you to leave. It's just time for you to go. And I just remember feeling in that moment shock, but also resolve, because I was going to go. And up until that point, you know, I think it's totally normal when you are a young person and you're like coming into adulthood, you want to be on your own and maybe have your own apartment and have your own things and kind of have your own schedule and be your own person. And I adored my family very close. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, we were in a family cult. So we were really in a bubble where we just had each other mostly. So there was some codependency going on pretty big time. But so I never wanted to separate from my family. But I did have those normal desires to live on my own and have my own things and be my own person. And so I used to think I'm never going to be able to do that because I don't think Dad is going to ever let me go. Because I didn't think that I could just say, you know what, I'm 21, I'm 22, and I think I'm going to move into an apartment. I didn't ever feel like that was something that I would be able to say or do, because I felt like he had still the authority over me to say, no, that's not a good idea. And I would have said, okay. So there was kind of a mix of feelings like, this is kind of crazy. I don't want to be forced out, but also I may never actually leave if I don't leave now. And there was part of me that thought he flew off the handle and maybe he didn't completely mean that, but I wasn't going to take the chance. And, he sleeps in pretty late, or at least he did at that point. So I left early before I knew he would wake up. I mean, I packed and I left and I went and stayed with my best friend and her family at the time. And I think my original plan was to let some time go by and let things kind of settle. I did not have a real good grasp on who Dad was. I didn't, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, more, but I didn't understand narcissistic personality disorder. I thought, okay, well, he's just struggling because I'm his firstborn daughter. We've always been close and he feels like he's losing me, and he's gonna like chill out after a bit of time. He just needs some time.
Well, and your understanding of it's time for you to go and his were two different things.
Yeah, I mean, you might tell me what, if he ever talked about that, did he say what he meant by that?
No, I don't think he ever described that conversation. The way I remember it being presented was in a more matter-of-fact way. I guess it wasn't like it was that he got angry and told you to go. It was more of as if it were a well thought out decision. It's kind of how it seemed like it was presented.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sure it changed as time went, and as he wanted to make the story sound a little bit better, because it doesn't sound great if you just say,
yell at your kid.
Yeah, you should go. After the second 4-hour talk your face off.
And I was just emotionally spent. After those two conversations, I remember that morning I told Mom I was packing and I said, I have to go. And, of course, she was very upset and she was asking me to not go. And I told her, I said, this is 2 nights in a row. I cannot do it another night. I didn't feel like I was capable. I thought something inside me would break. And I told her he just needs some time to calm down, and I will go stay with Laura, and then, in a few days we'll see how he's doing. Well, it ended up being 2 weeks. I remember mom, I was talking to mom on the phone some, and she was asking me to come back, and she asked me to come for dinner, and of course I was dying to see you and the other kids. And I came back, and boy, Dad was as cold as ice to me. I mean, he wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak to me. It was so incredibly uncomfortable. And I think all of you were a little bit confused and, not knowing what was going on. But I was fully embraced by all of you and mom. It was just Dad. And I remember I I went to use the phone, and he walked in and he goes, "This isn't your house anymore." Just a like I really think he thought by saying it's time for you to go that was going to trigger something in me to just step back in line with him. And when I didn't, I really think he was like, "Oh shit, what did I do?" I told her it was time to go. And mom even told me he told her, "Well, I didn't mean that she needed to go now." But he couldn't ever come back and say that I just left. He said the words, and he knows he said them.
And admitting for someone like our dad who has a narcissistic personality disorder, admitting that there was something that happened that was out of your control is a big thing. So even though it wasn't what he maybe intended, he couldn't go back and say like, "Oh, I didn't have control of it." He had to change that narrative.
That's so good, yeah.
To where it was a decision that I made, and like you experienced it, and I experienced that. I can't count how many times in my life everything had to be orchestrated at some level by him if it's something big that happened.
He thought of it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So that was not an accident. I think that was just some of that personality disorder coming out in full force to where he couldn't go back on that. Even though he did say it, he couldn't say that it was in jest, or that he was angry. He had to say the half measure to mom, which was, "Well, I didn't mean right now."
Right.
But he still meant you had to go.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really strange after that, because I kept coming back to the house, and I would come and eat dinner. I would just come and visit. And he was hostile. It was just a hostile environment. There was one day where he was sitting, and he was, our dad is an artist. He was sketching something at his table, and I walked past him, and I just had this moment of compassion for him, because I just thought, I don't know what it's like to be in his shoes. He probably feels like he's losing his firstborn child in a way, and this has to be hard for him. And I remember I passed him, and I was like, I'm going to go back and give him a hug. And again, this is before I really understood NPD. I thought maybe that would be an opening for us. And I remember I came up from behind him and I hugged him, and there was zero reciprocation, and he acted like, "What are you doing?" And then I just walked on. And obviously I know now I was no longer being his narcissistic supply. And so he didn't really have use for me. And this was just a really difficult time. I started having panic attacks a lot at night. They would only happen at night. I would wake up and I wouldn't be able to breathe. I thought I couldn't breathe. And I would just need to find I'd need to turn the light on and just know that I was okay, and then I could lay back down. It was really difficult, and Kurt supported me through all of that in a really loving way, and he asked me to marry him. I was definitely, in hindsight, not ready for marriage. We had not dated that long. I mean, he asked me to marry him in February, and we met the August before that. He lived 3 hours away. We didn't see each other at the most sometimes, like every weekend, but not every weekend. And that only started maybe in December. So this went really, really fast, as it does in the church. I said yes, and I told Mom, and Mom told Dad. And I think I'll skip ahead. We ended up getting married at the beginning of September 2nd. And right before that, in August, I happened to be where my fiance lived for the weekend, I think. And Dad called. And he said, I need you to come home. I have a message from God for you. And Mom got on the phone and she was crying. I would say hysterically crying. And I was really confused. They did not want to tell me what it was. They said I had to be there. And so I went. And I remember Kurt saying, I'll drive you. And I was like, no, I'm fine. I drove my car up there. I'll drive it. And he said, no, I don't have a good feeling about this. I want to drive you. And I was like, okay, but I'll have to come back and get my car 3 hours. But I went ahead and relinquished. I let him drive, and we got there, and I remember it was a Friday night, which is our Sabbath. I remember the lighting being kind of low. The whole mood, the tone, just everything was heavy and somber. I don't know if you were there, but I know Michael, our brother, talked to Kurt out on the front porch for a while. And I went inside. And Dad led me to his and Mom's bedroom. And it was dark in there. The lights were not on. There was a chair in there. I sat on the edge of the bed, and Dad sat across me in the chair. And I just remember him hanging his head and sighing and saying, Ashley, I've been given the gift of prophecy. And God has given me a message for you.